Imagine this, Charlie Kirk launches his big American comeback tour, and within hours he's assassinated. The very next day, HBCUs across the country are hit with threats, MAGA supporters storm campuses, and chaos erupts. But was this really just outrage? Or a carefully planned play to paint black students as the villains? On September 10, 2025, Charlie Kirk stood on stage for what was meant to be the triumphant launch of his Turning Point USA American Comeback Tour. The event carried all the energy of a political revival, with banners waving, chants echoing, and an audience filled with young conservatives who believed they were witnessing the beginning of something much larger than a speaking tour. The tour was billed as an effort to re-energize conservative youth after several turbulent years, positioning Kirk not only as a cultural voice but as a political lightning rod for the next phase of the right's grassroots movement. But what began as a celebration quickly transformed into tragedy. By the end of that same day, Kirk's life was cut short in an assassination that stunned both his followers and his critics. In a political landscape already marked by polarization and mistrust, his sudden and violent death landed like a shockwave. The gravity of the event deepened when the news wasn't immediately confirmed. Rumors swirled online throughout the night, with speculation running rampant until the official announcement came the following morning, on September 11th. That timing alone, so close to an already solemn national date, added an eerie weight to the moment. The hours between his assassination and its confirmation became a kind of digital battleground. Social media platforms lit up, with hashtags trending worldwide. On one end of the spectrum were grief-stricken supporters who saw Kirk as a defender of their values, a man who had dedicated his life to rallying young conservatives and standing against what they considered the excesses of progressive politics. They flooded timelines with tributes, old clips of his speeches, and calls for unity in his memory. To them, Kirk's assassination wasn't just a personal tragedy, it was proof of how hostile and dangerous the political environment had become for voices like his. On the other side, however, the reaction was far more complicated and, for many, more controversial. Kirk had long been a polarizing figure, known for his sharp rhetoric, confrontational style, and his unapologetic critiques of progressive movements. For his critics, his death stirred little sympathy. Some commentators used the moment to highlight what they considered his divisive legacy, while others expressed outright disdain. And in corners of the internet where anonymity often amplifies cruelty, there were even celebrations, people posting memes, jokes, and taunts about the assassination as if it were an occasion for mockery rather than mourning. Among these voices were individuals within the Black community, some of whom had long felt targeted by Kirk's rhetoric on issues ranging from affirmative action to movements like Black Lives Matter. For them, his passing symbolized the end of a figure who had openly opposed much of what they fought for. While some limited their comments to critical reflections on his career, others went further, crossing into celebratory territory. Screenshots of these posts quickly circulated, stoking outrage among Kirk's supporters. That outrage didn't remain online. Within hours, far-right commentators seized on those responses, using them as fuel to paint entire communities as hostile, ungrateful, or even complicit in fostering a climate that made Kirk's assassination possible. The nuance that many Black voices were simply offering critical perspectives rather than celebrations was stripped away in favor of sweeping generalizations. The narrative hardened. Look how they cheer our deaths. This reaction from the far right revealed more than just grief, it exposed deep-seated racial fault lines in American political life. Instead of focusing on the actual perpetrator of the assassination, many supporters directed their fury outward toward groups who had nothing to do with the act itself. Online forums, talk radio shows, and fringe news outlets began amplifying stories of anti-Kirk celebrations, framing them as evidence of moral decay and as justification for harsher political postures. What followed was an escalation. Threats began to surface not toward the shooter, whose identity was still being pieced together, but toward Black students, HBCUs, and even community organizations. It was as though the assassin's bullet had opened the door for a wider backlash, one that allowed pre-existing resentments to surge into the open. The death of Charlie Kirk had been personal, but the reaction became collective, directed at entire groups who were perceived as enemies of his cause. In many ways, this mirrored the pattern of American political violence throughout history. A moment of tragedy quickly converted into a tool for narrative warfare. Kirk had spent years positioning himself as a culture warrior, a man unafraid to confront what he saw as the failures of liberal ideology. In death, His persona was reforged again, this time, not by his own hand, but by the hands of his followers and adversaries. He became both martyr and villain, depending on who was speaking. And the truth of his life risked being overshadowed by the symbolism of his death. To understand why reactions were so sharp, one has to remember the unique place Kirk held in the political arena. Unlike older conservative figures, he had cultivated his base directly through digital platforms, often sparring with students on campuses, recording debates, and posting them online for millions to see. He thrived in conflict. Confrontation was part of his brand. So, when news of his assassination broke, it was no surprise that conflict continued to shape the discourse. Supporters didn't just grieve quietly, they mobilized his death into renewed calls for political battle. Critics didn't just acknowledge his passing, they dissected his career as proof of the dangers of his ideology. And opportunists on both sides turned the moment into content, ensuring that the tragedy spread not only as news but as fuel for ongoing wars of identity and ideology. Yet, what made this moment especially volatile was not simply the fact of his assassination, but the way the digital ecosystem processed it. Within minutes, platforms amplified the loudest, most extreme voices. Nuanced discussions about the dangers of political violence, or the need for de-escalation, were drowned out by sensationalized posts. Screenshots of celebratory tweets or angry rebuttals became viral within hours, creating a distorted picture of reality. What may have been the opinions of a vocal minority were reframed as the dominant response, further inflaming divisions. For the Black community, this dynamic was particularly dangerous. While some individuals had expressed harsh or celebratory views, the backlash treated these as representative of all Black voices. This homogenization ignored the diversity of opinion within the community, where many condemned the assassination outright, while still holding valid critiques of Kirk's policies. But in the world of rage-driven politics, nuance rarely survives. The focus became less about the individual act of violence and more about how that act could be leveraged against opponents. Meanwhile, the broader American public was left with an uneasy realization. The nation's political discourse had reached a place where even the violent death of a public figure could not unite people in shared condemnation. Instead, it became yet another flashpoint, another excuse to deepen divides. Kirk's assassination did not lead to reflection about the costs of polarization. Rather, it became an accelerant, feeding the very fires that had long defined his career. In the days that followed, memorials were held, debates raged on television, and social media remained ablaze. But beneath the noise was a deeper question, one that America has faced before and will likely face again. What happens when our politics becomes so toxic that death itself is weaponized as rhetoric? For some, the assassination was a call to double down, to become even more aggressive in defense of their cause. For others, it was a reminder of the human toll of endless antagonism, and for many caught in the middle, it was simply another painful sign of a country struggling to find common ground. Charlie Kirk's life ended on the opening day of a tour meant to symbolize a comeback. In a cruel twist, his death instead became a mirror reflecting the fractures of the nation he sought to influence. The tragedy was real, but so too was the lesson. When politics turns into warfare, even grief becomes a battlefield.
More HBCUs have received terroristic threats after this Charlie Kirk incident happened. Clark University, Alabama, Virginia, and Hampton University. They've been instructed to shelter in place, and if you left the campus, to stay away from the campus until...
In the days following Charlie Kirk's assassination, tension spilled over onto college campuses. Historically Black colleges and universities, HBCUs in particular, began receiving threats, leaving many students fearful enough to avoid classes altogether. White supremacist groups seemed determined to use the tragedy as an excuse to harass these institutions, despite the fact that the shooter was not Black at all, but Kyler Robinson, a white man from Utah. While some in the Black community had expressed harsh or even celebratory opinions about Kirk's death, their words were twisted into justification for hostility against HBCUs. By late September 2025, that hostility materialized in Nashville. A group calling itself Fearless Debates, closely tied to the MAGA Hats movement, appeared on the campus of Tennessee State University (TSU), a prominent HBCU located near Fisk University and not far from the historic Meharry Medical College. Setting up stalls and wearing red MAGA hats, the group displayed inflammatory slogans like "Day should be illegal and deport all illegals." Their presence was clearly designed to provoke, and it struck a nerve with both students and alumni. One alumna, Courtney Michelle, openly condemned the group online, ridiculing their hypocrisy. Pointing out their xenophobic chants, she argued that many of the same people calling others illegal had no deeper ties to America than the very communities they were targeting. As a proud foundational Black American, she reminded her audience that her ancestors had been in the country before it was even called America, building its foundation through forced labor and resilience. Meanwhile, students on campus documented the unfolding tension. Videos circulated, showing heated exchanges, students shouting back at the visitors, accusing them of ignorance, while the MAGA-affiliated group insisted they were merely hosting a debate. Police eventually stepped in, dispersing the outsiders and calming the scene, but not before the clash spread widely across social media. On the right, the incident was spun as proof of intolerance. One commentator, posting under the name Raging American, claimed, after only 15 minutes of fearless debates, Tennessee State students started a riot and attacked MAGA speakers. Every tax dollar funding this university should be revoked. For many observers, however, it was clear this confrontation was never about dialogue. It was a calculated move, an attempt to spark outrage, discredit HBCUs, and deepen divides. As one critic later summed up, the debate was simply the bait.
Have been showing up to HBCUs. And from the videos that I've seen, it doesn't seem like they're looking to have a peaceful conversation. To me, it more so seems like they're trying to antagonize rather than have an actual conversation, a constructive conversation. And this actually worries me in the grand scheme of things, because I don't want there to be any kind of blame put on the students of the HBCUs. I feel like they're being antagonized, and if they don't react in the actual perfect way, the media is going to twist it and call the students of the HBCUs problematic and aggressive and all of the words that they like to use. Also, it's kind of a safety thing as well, because when people are infiltrating your school and coming to your school, they might become aggressive with you, and it might not even be your.
One of the clearest takeaways from the incident at Tennessee State University was that the group calling itself Fearless Debates knew exactly what it was doing. They deliberately entered a space where tensions were already high, choosing an HBCU campus in full awareness that young Black students, like much of Black America, tend to lean progressive or democratic. On top of that, many students were still shaken by the earlier wave of threats against HBC, making their appearance even more provocative. The group's strategy was obvious: set up inflammatory signs about issues like day and immigration, wait for an angry response, and then claim victim. This is a classic form of rage baiting, where the goal isn't discussion but creating viral content that fuels a political narrative. Similar tactics had been used elsewhere, such as UNC Charlotte, where the group tried to link a tragic killing to Black Lives Matter, even though the movement itself was not responsible. The reality is that groups like this are chasing money and attention. Figures on the far right have learned that stoking division can be a lucrative business model. By provoking HBCU students into reacting, they could then frame the footage as proof that Blacks don't want civil debate, ignoring the larger context. Yet, unlike organized visits from speakers like Charlie Kirk or Myron Gaines, who at least went through the proper channels to appear on campuses with school approval, security, and clear structure, Fearless Debates bypassed all protocol. They showed up uninvited, without clearance, and left the university scrambling to contain the disruption. Tennessee State University later released an official statement confirming that the group was not affiliated with the school and had no authorization to be on campus. The statement condemned their hostile messages, emphasized that the university values free speech but not incitement, and clarified that campus and city police de-escalated the situation without violence. TSU also reaffirmed its commitment to being a safe space for dialogue and learning. But the deeper issue runs beyond a single campus visit. What happened at Tennessee State University was not an isolated stunt or a spontaneous clash of personalities. It was part of a deliberate, carefully designed strategy. The playbook is simple but effective. Identify communities with strong cultural or political identities. Introduce provocative messages guaranteed to inflame emotions, and then record the fallout. Once students or community members respond in frustration, those reactions are stripped of their context and repackaged for mass consumption. Clips of shouting crowds, angry gestures, or tense confrontations then circulate online, often framed as evidence of hostility, intolerance, or even lawlessness. For HBC, the stakes of this tactic are uniquely high. Historically, Black colleges and universities are not just academic institutions. They are symbols of Black resilience, achievement, and cultural pride. From their founding in the 19th century to their modern role in shaping leaders across politics, business, and the arts, HBCUs embody progress hard-won against centuries of systemic exclusion. To attack them is to strike at one of the most visible and enduring legacies of Black advancement in America. And that's precisely why these groups target them not for dialogue, but for if they can frame HBCUs as radical, dangerous, or undeserving of taxpayer funding, they weaken not only the schools themselves but also the broader institutions of Black empowerment. This is why many observers argue that the so-called fearless debates were never about conversation. They were about optics. They were about creating a spectacle that could be edited, reframed, and weaponized. By setting up inflammatory signs like "Days should be illegal" and "Deport all illegals" on the front lawn of a university filled with Black students, the group was not inviting dialogue, it was staging a performance. And when students shouted back, when anger flared, that was the climax of the performance. The debate was never the point. The footage was. The timing of this strategy is no accident either. Over the last decade, America has seen a dramatic hardening of political polarization. Under Donald Trump's presidency, right-wing groups grew increasingly bold, feeling validated and even celebrated for actions that might once have been considered fringe or unacceptable. Rhetoric that was once whispered in back rooms moved onto stages, news segments, and viral videos. With that shift came a new confidence. Not only could these groups spread their message, but they could also provoke without fear of real consequence. This emboldening effect is precisely what Claude Anderson warned of years earlier, when he predicted that white conservatives, feeling threatened by demographic and cultural changes, would escalate both their rhetoric and their actions. Today, that prediction reads less like speculation and more like prophecy fulfilled. Anderson's insight matters here because what we're seeing is not just provocation, it's strategy layered with historical awareness. For decades, whenever marginalized groups made strides toward equality, there were counter-movements designed to push back. During Reconstruction, Black political participation was met with violent resistance. During the Civil Rights era, school desegregation triggered waves of white flight and organized backlash. In the 21st century, the visibility of movements like Black Lives Matter and the growth of day programs in universities and workplaces triggered yet another wave of resistance. In that sense, the Fearless Debates visit to TSU was just one chapter in a much older story. When Black progress becomes visible, pushback follows. The dangerous brilliance of this modern tactic is how seamlessly it exploits the digital ecosystem. In the past, backlash might have been confined to angry op-eds, local protests, or small political campaigns. But now, a few viral clips can redefine the public narrative almost instantly. A 2-minute video of angry students shouting can circulate faster than a 1,000-word essay explaining why they were angry in the first place. Outrage, after all, is easier to consume than context. In a world where attention spans are shrinking and algorithms reward engagement over accuracy, the side with the most dramatic footage wins, not the side with the fuller truth. That's why the trap is so effective. When Black students respond emotionally, they aren't just expressing legitimate anger, they're unwittingly becoming characters in someone else's script. Their outrage becomes the raw material for propaganda, confirming the stereotypes and narratives their opponents want to sell. The brilliance of the trap lies in its self-reinforcing cycle. The more outrageous the provocation, the more emotional the reaction. The more emotional the reaction, the easier it is to frame as evidence of intolerance or aggression. This is why the lesson here is not about silencing anger but about recognizing the battlefield for what it is. The provocation is not aimed at dialogue, and the reaction is not recorded for fairness. It's bait. The only way to undermine the strategy is to deny it oxygen. Refusing to engage strips the spectacle of its climax. When students walk past the stall instead of confronting it, there's no viral clip. When alumni ignore the provocation instead of amplifying it, there's no controversy to monetize. Silence, in this case, is not weakness, it's strategy. But here's the paradox. Telling people not to react is easier said than done. For students at HBCUs, the presence of hostile outsiders on their campus is not just offensive, it's threatening. When a group of people show up with signs dismissing the value of diversity or labeling immigrants as illegitimate, It isn't experienced as abstract debate. It feels personal, invasive, and disrespectful to the very identity of the institution. To expect calm in the face of disrespect is to ask students to carry an almost superhuman level of restraint. And yet, as unfair as it sounds, restraint is exactly what protects the community from being used as fodder for someone else's narrative. It's worth remembering that this tactic doesn't only harm Black communities, it also distorts the democratic process itself. Democracy relies on good faith dialogue, on the assumption that both sides come to the table wanting to exchange ideas. But when one side comes not to listen but to provoke, the process becomes corrupted. The campus, traditionally a space for learning and exchange, is transformed into a stage for political theater. And when the footage of that theater becomes the basis for calls to defund universities or restrict DEI programs, democracy itself takes the hit. The broader danger is that these tactics normalize antagonism as a political tool. If baiting communities into conflict becomes a standard strategy, then public discourse will increasingly be shaped not by reasoned argument but by staged provocation. The loudest voices will not be those with the strongest ideas but those with the most effective outrage traps. And the result will be a political culture defined by manipulation rather than persuasion. That's why it's essential to step back and recognize the deeper currents at play. The incident at Tennessee State University is not about whether students should have shouted back or whether the group should have been allowed on campus. It's about understanding the design behind the moment. It's about recognizing that the spectacle was never about Tennessee State at all. It was about generating content, stoking division, and building a narrative powerful enough to shape policy and public perception. So the path forward requires both awareness and strategy. Awareness means recognizing provocation for what it is. Not a genuine invitation to dialogue, but an attempt to weaponize your humanity against you. Strategy means developing responses that protect dignity without feeding the spectacle, organizing amplifying positive narratives about HBC, or simply starving provocateurs of the conflict they crave. Because ultimately, the real battleground is not the campus lawn but the public imagination. If groups like Fearless Debates succeed, they will convince the broader public that HBCUs are hostile, intolerant, and unworthy of support. If they fail, it will be because communities refuse to let provocation define them. And so the lesson stands. Do not fall for the trap. Outrage is human, but in this climate, outrage is also currency, and giving it away too freely only enriches those who thrive on division. The refusal to play along is not surrender, it's defense, it's strategy, and in the long run, it's survival.